Well, it's good to see you all, and welcome to the first session. Without further ado, I too won't read the biographies that are in the program. Let me just introduce our first speaker, Dr. Mark Cherry from St. Edward's University in Austin, Texas. He'll be speaking on Will the Next Generation Be Orthodox? Confronting Secular Bioethics and Secular Culture. So, Mark.
Your Graces, members of the clergy, distinguished professors, my brothers and sisters in Christ. It's a great joy to be here. I am a philosophy professor, so I'm going to endeavor to hopefully lead somewhere rather than nowhere, but I'll try to do it as boringly as possible. Christian bioethics is a scandal. The defense of traditional Christian bioethical norms affronts the dominant secular culture of the West. After all, Orthodox Christianity knows the deep sinfulness of abortion, embryonic stem cell research, euthanasia and assisted suicide, recognizes the immorality of surrogate motherhood and sexual activity outside of the marriage of husband and wife, and confirms the authority of parents over children. Still, while it is appropriate to support such Christian norms, Christian bioethics must itself be authentically and distinctly Christian. It must sustain a bioethics that advances the gospel of Christ so as to bring people to Christ. Consequently, an authentically Christian bioethics will not be philosophical in the sense of relying primarily on discursive rational analysis, as if the study of Christianity and its implications for bioethics were just one analytic discipline amongst many. Christian bioethics must properly orient all persons towards the one true God. What this paper does is offers a conceptual geography of the collision between Christian bioethics grounded in the Orthodox Church's knowledge and experience of God and the banality of its secular counterpart. Humans are created to worship God and to come to know Him. This central reality of Christian moral anthropology must frame all of one's life. Consequently, as I argue, if we are to sustain an authentic Christian, Orthodox Christian culture, if we are to ensure that the next generation remains Orthodox, Christians must recognize that morality, and thus bioethics, cannot be sufficiently evaluated within an imminent horizon of human needs, interests, and passions. Christian bioethics must always maintain a transcendent focus. The contemporary secular bioethics that guides public policy and medical decision-making is not Christian bioethics. Western bioethics is very much after God. There has been a nearly wholesale rejection of traditionally religious, especially Christian accounts of moral obligations, and instead we find a rationalism that has been embraced that seeks to produce a morality justified through discursive human reason. Faith in moral philosophy has taken the place of faith in God. Even among many purportedly Christian scholars, philosophical analysis and progressive political activism has come to be seen as more important for bioethics than a mystical encounter with the living God. For example, Christian thinkers who continue to follow the ecumenical path set by the Second Vatican Council have sought to avoid the scandal of an authentically Christian bioethics. As a result, supposedly Christian scholarship routinely fails to stand as an openly and explicitly Christian bulwark over against the challenges of secularism. Much of today's purportedly Christian bioethics, for example, a step back from the mystical grounding that is central to the experience of God in the life world of Orthodox Christianity. Its preferred approach is to treat Christianity as a set of moral sentiments, rather than as an encounter with a personal God. Such scholarship, however, fails to take seriously God's real presence in the world. Rather than orienting persons towards God, or even sounding warnings against deeply sinful choices, such a weakened, more ecumenical approach appreciates Christ as but a teacher of moral virtue, a cultural reformer who sought to eliminate unjust and social and economic inequalities. Situated within such a weakened moral theological framework, much of what is supposed to be Christian bioethics is indistinguishable from progressive secular bioethics. In effect, it acts as if there is no God, or at least as if God's existence and his commands make no real difference to permissible human action. and its avoidance of secular scandals such that bioethics fails to be authentically Christian. To illustrate the centrality of this intellectual challenge, consider Immanuel Kant, who held that the Bible as a religious text ought to be, quote, forced into a moral dress in preference to the verbal and literal meaning whenever the last savors nothing of morality or perhaps tends even to snap our moral springs, end quote. Kant recognized that if the nature and content of the right, the good, and the virtuous were determined by God's willing them to be right, good, and virtuous, then significant tension would exist between ordinary moral philosophy and God's commands. Kant thereby deflated Christianity into a moral perspective, a set of moral sentiments, a mere account of moral duty. And if what matters is not submission to a living God and his commands, but living, as Kant put it, a well-regulated, exemplary life, that's a quote, and if the terms of this quote-unquote exemplary life are available through philosophy, then God is extraneous and a distinctively Christian bioethics, unnecessary and unwanted. Moreover, such scholars have come to appreciate rational analysis as possessing the authority to call into question Christianity's experience of God and permissible moral choice. Insofar as Christianity can be reduced to moral sentiments, then Christian norms can be straightforwardly revised and updated in light of currently popular philosophical arguments. As Kant argued, biblical commands are open to reinterpretation in light of reason. Kant, for example, stated that he would seek to determine if such commands, quote, can be adapted and accommodated into my moral principles, end quote. Insofar as the gospel of Christ is just a source of moral inspiration, Christianity is always open for reinterpretation in light of particular personal, social, or political interests. Here, consider, for example, the ways in which particular political interest utilizes language drawn from Christianity so as to corrupt Christian bioethics in support of a secular moral narrative. Concepts such as holiness and saint, for example, have been reconceptualized in terms of the secular good. Related concepts such as sanctity, spirituality, and ministry in the Lord's work are recast as living a life compatible with currently popular accounts of social justice, rather than in terms of submission in all things to God in love and repentance. Such language regards anyone who is good in the eyes of the world or who struggles for social justice to be a saint. Yet Christians must recognize the circumstance that much of the good of which secular morality approves is perverse. The moral order is routinely inverted. Secular morality, for example, judges abortion to be central to the basic human rights of women. George Tiller, a professional abortionist who performed late-term abortions even after 24 weeks of pregnancy, was described by his colleagues as a, quote, highly spiritual person, and referred to his abortion clinic as a, quote, ministry. Others who worked in his abortion clinic described their work in a religious fashion, and here I give you just a long quote. "I felt I was doing the Lord's work," said the staff member charged with readying the stillborn babies to be seen by their parents. In almost identical terms, the women who prepared the babies' bodies for cremation said, "God put me here to do this work." And the clinic chaplain, referring to the comfort she tried to give to grieving parents, recounted, "This was holy work we were doing here," end quote. Abortion apologists have described the procedure again in highly religious terms, and here's again another long quote. "During her abortion procedure, the patient turned to Claudia, a 50-year-old licensed vocational nurse who sat beside her. Claudia perched forward on her stool to get closer to the patient, and suddenly the patient grasped the crucifix that dangled from Claudia's necklace. The patient was very focused on the crucifix and seemed to stop paying attention to what was going on in the room. At the end, Claudia recalled, 'I said to her, Mihaia, it's over,' and she said, 'It is?' And then the patient took Claudia's hand, kissed it, and said, 'You're an angel.'" Note the intentional distortion of Christianity. Whereas St. John Chrysostom reminds us that all things done by the angels are of Christ, so that, quote, "the things also done through angels are of him," end quote. Here, secular morality has turned that very Christian teaching on its head to support a great evil. Abortion has been recast as a sacred choice. The abortion nurse is described as wearing a crucifix, rhetorically signifying sanctity. The woman who has had her child aborted kisses the nurse's hand as one might kiss the hand of a holy man. This deformation of Christian language undermines Christianity, assisting advocates to recast Western culture in terms of a very secular account of the right, the good, and the virtuous. Such distortions encourage us to treat as saints and martyrs those who have rejected Christ and his church. This strategy of recasting the Christian experience of God in terms of moral philosophy has had real significant impact. Moral norms that rely on the commands of God, but which are not justified in terms of secular rationality, have been critically brought into question. Any dissonance between secular bioethics and traditional Christian bioethics has come to be appreciated as impeaching religious rather than secular claims. Note, however, that secular bioethics is not remotely compatible with Orthodox Christian bioethics. Outside of a proper orientation towards God, taken for granted moral and spiritual expectations shift dramatically. Here, just consider the easy example of marriage. Orthodox marriage reveals God joining man and woman together into husband and wife as one flesh. It is a performative act that accomplishes an ontological change, a shift in being, which is not reducible to an exchange of promises or to a contractual relationship between persons. Holy matrimony is a divine institution. In contrast, the dominant secular culture considers decisions about sexual practices and reproductive choices to be, quote-unquote, private and largely beyond moral judgment. The moral significance of such choices has been deflated. Decisions to engage in sexual experimentation are seen as morally neutral, as long as they are consensual and affirm the dignity of the parties involved. There is a presumption in favor of sexual freedom, the pursuit of pleasure and self-satisfaction. This secular worldview is characterized as supporting social and political equality for men, women, and children who prefer such relationships outside of the marriage of man and woman. Indeed, the demographic shift towards adults is living together with a sexual partner without marriage, or living simply as a sexually active single without even a live-in partner. An increase in the number of children born to single mothers and significant annual expenditures, something like $17 to $23 billion a year in the United States, is spent on the direct medical costs associated with STDs. Those are only two of the more predictable outcomes of this cultural shift. Moreover, when many people finally decide to have children, regardless of whether or not they marry, important other interests often interfere. There is real pressure, for example, to ensure that offspring be free from significant mental or physical disabilities. A disabled child would impact on career, lifestyle, and financial goals. This desire to give birth to a perfect and healthy child who fulfills our lifestyle expectations has pushed the boundaries of medicine. Consider a few brief examples of this clash. First, the secular ethos encourages the use of abortion to choose when or if to have children. This includes prenatal diagnosis and selective killing in utero of children with a likelihood of significant disabilities. Denmark, for example, instituted routine prenatal screening for Down syndrome in 2006 as a public health initiative. Other European countries, including France and Switzerland, followed. But as I'm sure you know, there's no way to cure Down syndrome. What they do instead, if the child tests positive, they simply have an abortion. Second, research teams have created children with more than two parents. They've found ways to manipulate human embryos so as to substitute the original mother's mitochondrial DNA with a donor female's mitochondrial DNA. The goal is to generate human babies without defects that might be attached to those chromosomes. Third, assisted reproduction is being provided for same-sex couples, as well as single women who want to reproduce. Secular bioethics judges access to assisted reproductive services, usually at taxpayer expense, central to civil rights and moral equality. Fourth, surrogate motherhood has become socially acceptable. Couples are paying women to gestate and give birth to children on their behalf. Surrogacy contracts create different types of arrangements for the production of children, such as, for example, the surrogate mother to be impregnated with the husband's sperm, gestational surrogacy, in which the husband and wife create an embryo with their own sperm and ovum, but hire another woman to carry the child to term, and a variety of other methods. Fifth, in a growing number of cases, parents have had their children, including very young children and teens, medically or surgically altered so that the child's phenotype, their appearance, and personal attributes, as well as potential or actual sexual behavior, maps onto the child's current gender preferences, the gender preferences of the parents or other interested parties. Lost in this cacophony of medical technological choices is the Christian recognition that the union of husband and wife is the uniquely appropriate locus for reproduction, and an involvement of third parties in the reproductive relationship of husband and wife is a form of adultery. The purchase of gestational services for the delivery of a healthy baby, for example, willfully sets aside the bonds of Christian marriage so as to reproduce in accordance with one's own particular lifestyle choices. Extramarital partners such as gamete and embryo donors or gestational carriers should not be invited into the intimate relationship of husband and wife. Moreover, it's not permissible to eliminate children from the family when through prenatal diagnosis they're found to be imperfect. Nor are we to deny the goodness of the body that God has provided through inappropriate surgical or medical alteration. Everything, including the sexual union of husband and wife, as well as the conceiving and raising of children, is to be done in a way that is compatible with approaching holiness. Now, I've been told I have 2 minutes, so I will skip the next section, which simply says secular bioethics cannot ground its claims. Simple. I'll go right to the conclusion. And we can talk about why it can't ground its claims if you want to. Knowledge of God and His commands, including understanding our moral obligations, requires us to change. The role of the traditional ascetic disciplines, prayer, fasting, almsgivings, frequent confession and repentance, for example, is to aid in the development of spiritual discipline, as one learns to set aside one's own passions and desires so as to acquire will and union with God. Rightly oriented and guided, such practices can be spiritually therapeutic, engaging in action which changes oneself and leads one closer to God, treats the soul, and cures the effects of sin so that one can learn to judge rightly. As St. Maximus put it, quote, "Afflict your flesh with hunger and vigils, and apply yourself tirelessly to psalmody and prayer. Then the sanctifying gift of self-restraint will descend upon you and bring you love," end quote. For our salvation, we must come into union with God, which requires not just living a Christian, morally upright life, but a life transformed by God. Secular morality absolutely fails in this regard. Pace Kant, Christianity is neither a philosophical system nor a set of personal values or moral sentiments. As H. Tristram Engelhart Jr. has noted, as many of you know him as Reader Herman, quote, "Christ came not preaching philosophy, but inviting a very specific confession of him as the Messiah of Israel and the Son of the living God," end quote. Orthodox Christianity, and again I quote from him, does not recognize the jurisdiction of an independent moral perspective that can critically bring into question the norms of behavior supported by a rightly ordered religious life, end quote. If the next generation is to be Orthodox, we must take seriously the presence of God in the world, His commands, and the Church's experience of His revelation to us. We must neither talk nor act as if Orthodox Christian bioethics is merely one more idiosyncratic and culturally embedded worldview. This is where people say things like, "in my tradition," as if there were lots of different traditions and each were multiply equally good. We shouldn't talk like that. We should simply say, this is the truth, right? Rather, an Orthodox Christian bioethics must of necessity challenge the nature, substance, and content of secular bioethics and a secular culture. Taken seriously, such a Christian bioethics will drive a wedge between Christians and non-Christians. It will also divide the various Christian religions from each other. It will not be ecumenical. It will be scandalous in the eyes of the world. But as Engelhart noted, quote, "Should the moral sentiments of the religious life offend ordinary, that is, secular moral intuitions, sentiments, and settled judgments, then so much the worse for ordinary morality." Such a Christian bioethics, however, will permit us better honestly to appreciate how and why one ought to live a fully Christian life. And more importantly, rightly lived, such a Christian bioethics ought to help one navigate the narrow path towards God. Y'all, thank you so much for your kindness today.